What does it mean to be truly responsible? What does it mean to be truly able to say you've actually made a difference in this world? In this call to action, environmentalist and mountaineer and Vice President of Environmental Affairs of Patagonia, Ridgeway, will explore how desperately important it is for entrepreneurs to focus solely across the world on their environmental practices. To the Planet Tech stage, please welcome Ridgeway.
Yes, thank you. Can I have the version that has my notes on the screen here, please? I'm at a tech conference, so I got to make sure I have the tech part right. Thank you. Well, I was walking the pavilion a few minutes ago with my wife, who's here with us in the audience, and we were both born in 1949, and I said to her, you know, we have to be the oldest people in this entire arena. So thanks for coming this afternoon to listen to how the world looks like through the eyes of an old geezer. To get things started at Patagonia, we're in business to use our business to decrease environmental impact and increase social justice. We're privately held, still owned by our founder, Yvon Chouinard, the guy with the hammer, who started the company making hardware for climbers, pitons, carabiners, ice axes. And when he started making clothes, also originally for climbers as well, he called that part of the business software as opposed to the hardware. But he had to drop that name when a guy up in Seattle named Bill Gates ripped us off. And that was kind of ironic because back in those days, Yvon and his buddies were kind of, well, let's just say they were pretty low tech. And I mean, Yvon is going to turn 80 years old in 2 weeks, and he still doesn't even know how to type. But when he started Patagonia in the early 70s, most of us associated with the company were outdoor athletes, climbers and surfers and backcountry skiers, and that's still the way it is. Yvon and I go way back about 50 years as climbing partners with a lot of expeditions under our belt, including this photograph of us in Alaska celebrating a successful ascent of Denali. And I'll just say that there's a lot more than alcohol involved and leave it at that. But in 1980, Yvon and I, along with some other very close of our friends, including one named Jonathan Wright, were attempting to climb a remote mountain in Tibet called Minyakonka. Things were going okay until one day at about 20,000 feet, we were caught in an avalanche. Swept down the mountain about 1,500 vertical feet. And I was sure there was no way I was going to get out of it alive, but then the snow slowed and stopped. And I was injured, and so was Yvon, but not as badly as Jonathan. I tried to keep him alive, but after a half hour, he died in my arms. And we buried him under a mound of rocks next to where he died. And we went home, and I went into a deep introspection. Should I keep climbing? I didn't know if I could. It took me a couple of months to think it through, but I had to review what I'd learned, what I'd taken from the high elevations and brought down to my life at sea level. I thought about how you learn on a climb to make a plan, but how inevitably stuff happens and you got to adjust. And I thought about tenacity, about how on big mountains like K2, you get to the top the same way you go about eating an elephant. You do it one bite at a time. And maybe the most important lesson, and one that was the easiest to ignore because it seemed like the most banal, but in truth it was actually the most important and the hardest, because it's so omnipresent, and that was that the real goal isn't the summit, but it's the footsteps to get there. So those were a few of the lessons that I learned over the years. But after that avalanche, after Jonathan died in my arms, and I thought I was going to die, I realized that I wasn't the same person. Sometimes I was waking up just amazed to still be alive. And I remember one day walking into the office and just stopping in the parking lot to feel the difference in the side of my face that was in the sun to the side that was in the shadow. I was in a way feeling like I had been reborn, and I had a new awareness of what it was like to be alive. And with that new awareness, I realized how quickly all of us cannot be alive. And one day I ran into a poem by Mary Oliver, that famous one called Summer's Day, with its famous last line that seemed to summarize my challenge. Tell me, the poem said, tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. And that was my challenge, a challenge that included the decision of whether or not I was going to go back to climbing. And meanwhile, I had my professional life. I was working as a writer and a filmmaker and a photographer. And at the same time, Yvon was continuing his work growing Patagonia, which was back then only 10 years old. And like Yvon, my work was rooted in nature. He was making gear for the outdoors, and I was making images of the outdoors. And if I was going to turn my back on the outdoors, wouldn't I be turning my back just on not where I'd come from, but where I could possibly and potentially go? And it was much more than just how I made my living. So I returned to climbing and to adventure and to exploring ice caps and jungles and rivers, and I started my own agency representing about 150 photographers and filmmakers, and we licensed reproduction rights to what today you call content. But Patagonia was my main customer, and Yvon and I remained best friends, and I had a ringside seat watching him increasingly commit the company to be an agent for environmental protection. And we continued to go on trips together. I could see how those experiences were influencing our increasing commitment to environmental protection. The expeditions included a trip to Patagonia, the place in the southern tip of South America. And there, back in the late 60s, Yvon and a few buddies had climbed a new route on that high mountain there called Fitzroy. And the two of us went back there exactly 20 years later, but now instead of total wilderness, there was this grid of roads and street signs and survey markers. And it soon became an entirely new city in Argentina called Chaltén. And on that trip, and a lot of others before and after that, we saw firsthand the forests that had been clear-cut and the grasslands that had been overgrazed and turned into deserts. And most alarming, we saw with our own eyes the glaciers that we climbed when we were kids that were now disappearing. And when you witness geologic change, geologic time and human time, and when we started to get our heads around what that really meant, we became increasingly committed to doing something about it. Now, this was no coincidence that these commitments had followed the avalanche, and that they came out of answering that question of what I was going to do with my one wild and precious life. And Yvon, too, continued to focus on increasing Patagonia's commitment to environmental protection, to giving more of the company's money to environmental nonprofits, and to making its products with the smallest environmental harm. And at the same time, my photography and film agency was shifting from having not only imagery that celebrated nature, but we increasingly had to provide imagery that showed the increasing destruction of nature. And this was now in the late 90s, and the photography industry was in the middle of the digital revolution. I had a good opportunity to sell my company, and that's what I did. And soon after that, I was invited to join the board at Patagonia, and a little bit after that, the company asked if I would take over and manage all their environmental initiatives. And I wasn't sure, so I asked my wife, and she said, well, you know, you're kind of like just turned 50 years old and maybe you ought to try this thing called having a regular job. But I was a little cautious about going to work for my best friend because I didn't want to jeopardize that friendship. But at Patagonia, it wasn't just another company, and not just because my best friend owned it, but because by then Yvonne had firmly set the company on its path to what today is called purpose-driven. And at this point in my life, I felt like I too needed to be purpose-driven, that those changes that had started when I walked away from that avalanche needed to continue to guide me. And I realized my personal purpose had to be in alignment with a company that had a higher purpose of delivering value, not just to its shareholders, but to all its stakeholders, to its customers, to its employees, to its communities, and especially, and most importantly, to the protection of our one and only home planet. So I accepted the role, and initially I oversaw the company's environmental initiatives, realizing my new opportunities fit closely to the company's mission statement to make the best product while at the same time causing no unnecessary harm, and then using the business to implement solutions to the environmental crisis. And there were a lot of ways that the company was going about realizing its mission. One was a program called 1% for the Planet, where we took 1% of our sales and gave it back to environmental nonprofits. And this was serious money because this was 1% of sales. Not profits, but good year or bad year, rain or shine, that money went into a fund that was redistributed to grassroots nonprofits with lots of volunteers like this group trying to save the Colorado River. And who wouldn't give a grant to these guys? And last year, we made over 1,000 grants to environmental groups around the world, protecting rivers and forests and wetlands. But at the same time, while we were supporting activists, we increasingly have become activists ourselves. When Trump announced that he intended to reduce the size of some of our country's protected public lands, we sued him. And if he tries to drill on or mine on those lands, we're going to take him to court. And here in Europe, we have another campaign. Thank you. Here in Europe, we have another campaign called the Blue Heart of Europe to stop the construction of nearly 3,000 dams on rivers in the Balkans. And you might be thinking I just made a mistake, but I didn't. 3,000 dams on the last free-flowing rivers in this continent. And finally, even after all these commitments, even after giving away 1% of our sales, we're still solidly profitable, even after investing in social justice efforts like our Fair Trade Initiative. So the more we grow, the more we give back. But even with all this, we still struggled with the paradox of growth. Asking ourselves if we keep growing, are we going to become the problem instead of the solution? And one way we solve that is through a partnership with our customers. It's called Warmware, and it was inspired by that mission statement, by the commitment to making the best product but causing no unnecessary harm. And to fully cause no unnecessary harm, we realized we had to partner with you guys, because we calculated that about half the environmental footprint comes from our customers who use and care for the stuff that we make and you guys use. So we started a partnership organized around the 4 R's of sustainability. And then we had to get our heads around the hardest one of all, the last R, to reduce. So to get that conversation going, we ran a full-page ad of one of our best-selling jackets in the New York Times with the headline, "Don't buy this jacket." And we wanted to stop people in their tracks so they would read the copy, because there we explained that no matter how hard we tried to make that jacket, causing no unnecessary harm, guess what? It still took 135 liters of water to make it, and it still produced 20 pounds of CO2 gases, and it still left behind 2/3 of its own weight in waste. And we wanted to remind everybody, our customers, but everybody, that if human beings don't figure out how to address the issue of annual growth of global consumption by a global population going from 7 to 10 billion, we're all going over the cliff. And the ad created a whirlwind of debate, with some critics calling us hypocrites because our business continued to grow and we were challenging growth. So who were we to do that? Well, they had a point, and that unleashed an internal debate that went all the way to the board of directors. The arguments went on for nearly 2 years until we realized the answer was again in that mission statement that had inspired us to run that ad in the first place. It was the realization that if we stayed committed to making the best product, which means the most durable product, which has the smallest footprint because it's used for the longest, and if we made that causing no unnecessary harm, and then if we partnered with you guys to get you to cause no unnecessary harm, then at the end of the day, as we grew, weren't we growing more solutions? So eventually, we got comfortable with our own growth, as long as that growth did not diminish in any way our commitment to our core values, but in fact actually made them stronger. And that's where we're at now. But that's not to say that it's a place that from a wider perspective makes us feel comfortable, because what if everyone, not just all of you guys in the room here today, but everybody across the world, what if everyone took us up on our request not to buy any stuff that you don't need? What's going to happen to the global economy when the whole economy is underpinned by this connection to annual compounded growth? Well, we don't have the answer to that question because nobody does. But it's the kind of question that at Patagonia we like to ask. It's one of our core values to keep asking questions until we get down to the core root of any problem, the core impact of our actions. And a good example of how that works is to look at a new extension of our brand into food, where we started Patagonia Provisions, because we recognize that of all the activities that we humans go about on our planet, producing food has the biggest impact on the environment, but it also has the biggest opportunity for solutions. And right now we have a handful of products that include fruit bars and breakfast cereals and whole grain soups and bison jerky. And just recently we introduced a new product that everybody's really excited about, beer. And we call it long root ale. And that's because it's made from a perennial wheat called kernza that grows extremely long roots, as you can see in this photograph of kernza alongside traditionally grown industrial wheat. And when you have roots this long, there's two things that happen. First, the roots turn the soil into a sponge, and it starts to soak up and retain water. And second, the root systems support an explosion of microorganisms in the soil, insects and fungus and bacteria, all of which, of course, are living things, all of which are made out of carbon. So what happens? The soil begins to pull the carbon out of the air and put it back into the ground. How much carbon? Well, the data is still coming in from farms all around the world, but scientists are beginning to estimate that if maybe half of the world's production of food converts to these regenerative techniques, that alone could get atmospheric carbon back to pre-industrial levels. Imagine that. And that's why we're in food. And that's why we're experimenting with how to grow regenerative cotton, including tests underway right now in India, because if we can figure this one out, then we can use that to make regenerative clothes. And then the shirt that you buy from us could represent a measurable amount of carbon that's been pulled out of the air and sequestered back into the ground. And that would mean that instead of causing no unnecessary harm, maybe we would be creating some intentionally necessary good. And that has us thinking about our entire mission statement. Maybe it needs a radical update. And we've assigned that task to a team right now that's looking into the possibility. Well, still another example of a company willing to ask the hard questions, all in service of this mission, all the reason that we're in business, that is larger than itself. Now, not surprisingly, when you have a business with a higher purpose, it attracts a lot of people who want to work for you. And at Patagonia, we get to pick from the best and the brightest, and that includes our intern program, where just last summer we had 9 interns fill positions for the summer, and we had just under 10,000 applications. And that makes it a whole lot harder to get into Patagonia than it is to get into Harvard. Well, several years ago, one of our interns included a young woman. who was an active outdoor athlete and who at the time had just turned 20 years old. Yvonne and I had known her because 19 years earlier, when she was a year old, her father, Jonathan, had died in my arms in that avalanche in Tibet. And her name was Asia because her father had named her after his favorite place in the world. And after we buried him in Tibet, in that remote grave, Yvonne and I stayed in touch with her, seeing her every year or two as she grew up, trying to be fill-in fathers. And now she was an intern at the company, and I knew that before the summer was over, she'd want to know more about her father, because after he died, her mother had shut his memory out of their lives. And sure enough, at the end of that summer, Asia asked me if we could have a chat. And I didn't hold back. I told her about her father, about the avalanche. I told her about how I'd held him for a half hour, given him mouth-to-mouth, trying to keep him alive, and he died in my arms. And she thanked me. And she said that wasn't the only reason that she wanted to talk to me. She said the other reason was that she had a favor. And she wanted me to take her to the mountain where her father had died, to climb up it and find his grave. And I told her I had to think about it. I went back to my wife and asked her, and she said, well, of course you're going, because Asia's asking you to not just find her father's grave, but she's asking you to be her father. And I knew that if her father had lived, he would have taken her on some of his trips, and certainly those trips would have included Asia, the place. So that's what we did, Asia and I. We started in the Everest region, where her father and I had once done a story for National Geographic, and where many of his Sherpa friends were still there, and his friends became his daughter's friends. We ventured to western Tibet, into mountains that had hardly been explored, where we climbed an unnamed and unclimbed mountain that was 21,000 feet high. And in eastern Tibet, we approached the flank of Minyakonka, where her father had died. And it had been 20 years, and I wasn't sure I could find the grave. But finally, on that barren, high buttress, we found it, and only now it had been torn apart, probably by a snow leopard. And the two of us had to gather my old friend's bones, his daughter and me, and we rebuilt the grave, and we strung fresh prayer flags over it, and we said our own prayers, and we made our own Thanksgiving, and we started on the long journey home. The full trip, the pilgrimage, had taken about 2 months, and in that time, I told Asia the stories. I told her the lessons, some of the same ones that I've shared with you. Many of the same lessons about how you have to plan and have to know that stuff goes wrong and you need to change or adjust your plan, and how you go about eating the elephant one bite at a time, and how you go about your life knowing that it's not about the summit, but it's about the footsteps. It's about the way that you get there. That if you're in business, your business needs to have a purpose more than just business. Just as your life has to have a purpose, and that purpose needs to be more than just about you, but it needs to be about how you can be more than yourself. And since most of you here are in business, working for a business, starting your own business, and knowing what you know now, I'll challenge you the same way all those years before I challenged myself. And that is to tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life.